been a while since I've done a video. I have a little bit of a cold. I've had a cold for about over a week, and I have a cough drop in my mouth. But it's been a while since I've been able to make a video, and there's been some things I've been wanting to share with you guys. Um, I have I have a mystery that I'm trying to solve with my family. I think I told you guys that a few months ago when I took the DNA test for ancestry. I I talked about in a previous video some of the things that I was wondering whether or not we had um, any African American, in our heritage anywhere, or if we had, if there was a possibility of my biological grandfather being somebody who had an affair with my grandmother. And, you know, honestly, when I got my results, I kind of felt like for the ancestry results are less detailed. I've heard that. But there was nothing, it didn't really show any kind of black heritage or anything, which was kind of disappointing because that was kind of a rabbit hole that I wanted to go down. But when it came to when I was looking at the DNA matches, it kind of said European and Germany. Let's get settled again. Miko, get into the bed, crazy. All right. My dog wants to be in here with me. Okay. So, getting back to the topic. Yes. When my initial, I guess, reaction to what I saw on Ancestry was kind of what I expected. Actually, it was like it was about 95% European. There was British. There's a lot of Germany. There was some Ireland and some Sweden. There's a little bit of Norway, but I was pretty much all white compared to that. Like that was pretty much what it said, and I guess it was just a little bit of what I expected. I wanted to be a little more like, oh wow, there's something, that must be, different. But there was nothing that really stood out to me in that moment, and I didn't really have the time to do research on the DNA matches. But at my as I was looking at my DNA matches, the names that I saw weren't anybody I recognized. Like there was no like family names that I would have recognized at all. So I was telling my husband, like, I don't know any of these names, like, as we were looking for them. So like that was kind of my first, but I didn't really have time to dig in at the time. And so at that point, I just kind of felt like, well, like, because my we grew up as Newmans. Like Newman was a family name that my dad had. His father, the father that raised him was Dr. Newman, and Dr. Newman had a lot of mental issues, and he, for really no the reason, but he ended up committing suicide right before he turned 50. And we attributed that to Huntington's disease. Like we felt like once at the time they didn't know about that, my family, but when my dad was diagnosed with Huntington's disease, um, that was kind of like, oh yeah, it must have come from, because we knew he had suffered from mental issues. There's something going on with him towards the end of his life, and he was really depressed. He was taking a lot of prescribed medicines because he was a dentist. He got his hands on, he was probably got his hands on things that he shouldn't have, but he did. So he was just trying to fix a problem, I think, by himself. Um, and for that reason, we just thought, well, he must have been the one who had Huntington's disease, and he had other aunts and his mom, who had kind of, and because Dr. Newman's mom and had died in her 50s, and people had said that it was kind of rumored that she was kind of crazy and just kind of kept to herself as part of aging. But that was just the thought that we had had, you know. And so I guess once we kind of knew about Huntington's disease, I think most of our family kind of moved on thinking that there was really no possibility that the man who had had the affair with my grandmother could have possibly been the dad, because I thought, well, because this man, that the man who had the affair, his name was Dr. Frank Clark, and Dr. Clark lived to be very old, maybe in his 80s, and so it didn't seem obvious that he was carrying the gene for any reason. So there's a lot of like reasons, and I know that um, I know my mom did a lot of research when, with a family tree and trying to figure out like where it came from. Once she found out like that we that her that us Newman kids were at risk for this. So there's a lot of research done. They were trying to figure it out, and I guess they really felt like for their strong reasons and beliefs. Okay, all right, and for those reasons, I'm sorry guys, I'm just terrible right now. I'm just trying to do what I can do. But for that reason, like my mom, you know, didn't seem, she always believed that, that there was no way that Dr. Clark could have passed this down because of his older age. And so that was kind of like left where it was. My grandmother, of course, who had the affair, always strongly denied that there was any possibility, of this ever happening. And there were stories, like all the stories that she told were, that one of the things that we knew is that she and her husband, Dr. Newman, had trouble carrying a baby. They would, I think they could conceive, they would just miscarry. It's better. It's more even. My light sucks today because of the storms. So getting on with the mystery of my family, there were a lot of reasons why everyone had decided. So my grandmother had always denied, completely denied that it was possible. That she had always said that she and Dr. Newman had to end up, they were 10 years. I think they were married for about 10 years, and when they still didn't have any kids at that point, and they were kind of getting a little more desperate to have kids. And Dr. Newman, I think most of all it was more Dr. Newman. He desperately wanted a child, and they were considering, I think they were just like trying to figure out like what they're. So according to my grandmommy's story, let's see, I have some pictures here to help. Okay, here we go. So this is a picture of the day that my dad was born, and this is like the family stories of what we're trying to do. Okay, so this was Dr. Newman, this was her husband, and this was my grandmother. This is my dad. This is the day that he was born, and he was born in 1956. Interesting to know, because the fact that my grandmother was, when I heard that explanation again recently with all this, considering like, well, what is her story and what were the reasons why? Like, how does she just not think it was possible? Like, what were her reasons why? Because she would always explain it away. She would never have this conversation with my dad. She would always shut it down, and it would just, she had to like, she was never going to talk about this or like discuss it. And she had to, and she said that they had gone to in vitro fertility stuff. And when I heard that story again, because I was going back to different people trying to figure out like, well, what did she say? Like, like what were her reasons to be so strongly that this did not happen. I heard recently again that she had talked about how like they had in vitro in order to have my dad because like he was like that special of a baby. He was their miracle. Like he was their everything. Like I know that when they had him, he was spoiled. He was very, but it was because they had such a hard time, having kids. And so that was like the miracle. He was their miracle, and they had in vitro, and they did some sort of fertility stuff, or I don't know. But as I was thinking about that, I was thinking, you know what? Like in the last couple of weeks, I was thinking, I'm not even sure when did in vitro even. When was the first in vitro baby? When did it happen? Like it sounds a little weird because my dad was born in the 50s. It doesn't seem like a process that they would have back then, or that it would work. So I started doing a little research about in vitro, and it was very clear to me. This is very interesting because I found um, all over the internet that the first in vitro baby apparently. So it looks like the very first in vitro was the woman who was born in 1978. So that was that was about 50, at least 15 years after my dad. My dad was born in 1956. Yeah, 1956. And um, yeah, so that kind of floored me. I was thinking, well, why would my grandmother claim that my dad was some miracle in vitro baby? And the fact that for 10 years she and her husband had not been able to carry their own baby and have their own. So, so I kind of felt, I don't know, that just seemed very weird to me. It's not the first, you know, I've heard, I don't know, just, yeah. So that certainly didn't make her seem very believable if making that story, and just nobody thought to look up when to be true until now. I don't know. Anyway, so that was very interesting to me, and I thought, well, I guess my grandmother was lying about that, and if she was lying about that, she was probably lying about the time frame, because her other explanation was that there's no possible way the Newmans weren't living in Austell until after my dad was like conceived and born. Like, and I guess that there was the timing of them. So what I started doing is I looked at the newspaper ads I had that are linked to Ancestry, and I started looking for some newspapers within Austell for with the year in the year 1955, the year before that my dad was born, and then I looked for James William Newman, to see if he was in any papers, because like he was, of course, he was kind of a well-known guy with, he in the city of Austell. He was definitely very I don't know. He was kind of a big guy, so I kind of felt like I had found other clippings about him, but I specifically like narrowed it down to 1955 to see if they were there. And interestingly enough, I found one article with his name saying that he was supposed to be at a city meeting with somebody else, and they listed his name. They had James William Newman, and they had, I mean, I'm pretty sure that he was the only James William Newman in the town at the time, because this was like, this was about, this is in the 50s. Like, I think that was about the time. I know that Dr. Clark and his family, he was a medical practitioner, and they had been in Austell for a while, at least a decade or two. They had, and he already had, he was also older, and so I was trying to calculate the time where how old he would be when my dad was conceived, and I think he would have been about 50. So he was older. He actually had three sons, with his wife, and so about 10 years so they kind of had a family, like their family, like they were a little bit older than like the Newmans, and so they had, interesting enough. So that in case you want. These are things I just had to kind of look at. But I just kind of felt like I did find the newspaper clipping where it said that James William Newman was at some town meeting in 1955. And 1955, of course, is the year before my dad was born. So I feel like I feel like all of the explanations that have been thrown at me, or just sort of, well, this is these are the facts, this is the truth, this is why, these are all the reasons why that, Dr. Clark can never be, your dad's, father, real father. And honestly, there are so many secrets, guys. Like, there's so many secrets in my family. Like, for on my dad's side, there was a ton of secrets. My grandmother was like secret person. Like, she was very controlling. She wanted to be in control of everything, and she was a little manipulative, and but she just had a lot of secrets. There were certain things that she just, like, I wouldn't be surprised if she was like lying about this and just making some story. And so my big question, so here's the thing. Here are my thought patterns. Like, I got about a few months after I had gotten my ancestry results, I got a message from, it was actually at the very beginning of March. I got a message from a contact who had just taken a test recently, a DNA and they said, "Hey, it looks like we're related. Do any of these family names look familiar to you?" And it listed about they listed about four different names, and I guess they were last names. And I thought, well, none of them look familiar to me, but apparently we were a DNA match, and I didn't know who this person was, but they didn't know who I was. They were just like, well, who, like, we're just curious, like, trying to figure out who the matches are. And so they had reached out to me, trying to see who I was. And but one of the names was vaguely familiar to me, and that was Birdsong. And I thought, well, you know what? They asked if the last name Birdsong was a family name of mine, or anybody that I might be related to. And so I thought, gosh, like, that is such an original name, like Birdsong. And I remembered it being, I was thinking about it, and I was like, I think I remember that being a part of Dr. Frank Clark's name somewhere. Like, I had to look up his grave on the grave website, and it shows like his name. I had to make sure that I was thinking correctly. So I looked it up, and I saw on the, it said that Dr. Clark's name was Dr. Clark Birdsong. I'm sorry. It said his name was Dr. Frank Birdsong Clark. That's a mouthful. So, anyways, I looked at this name, but of course, Birdsong was his middle name, and so I kind of thought, like, well, it's this guy's asking for Birdsong if it was whether or not it was a last name, and it may not be. So I sent him the link to Dr. Clark's grave, and when he responded, he said, "Yeah, actually, this is like it was like a cousin of his," and he said he told me that Dr. Clark's mom was sisters to his mom. And so it said that we were like third or fourth cousins. Like, that's what it said. We were third or fourth cousins, which meant we had a great, I don't know, like, it looked like that So this guy was telling me that it looked like, this is like really, and he's connected that, Dr. Frank Burson Clark was a relative of his. And um, so I was a little bit blown away. I was like, okay, but I want to keep making sure that this was correct, was right, that this guy was. So we kept going back and forth about, because he didn't know who I was, and he was just, seeing, and it turns out that Birdsong was, as I was doing some more research and things he was telling me, I realized that Birdsong was actually Dr. Clark's mom's maiden name, and so she had named him Birdsong. His middle name was Birdsong because that was her maiden name, so that made sense. So it was actually a last name in the family, but of course he had his mom was a Birdsong, and his dad was a Clark, which of course, so he had the Clark name. I was a little taken, by all that. It was a little moment, but it was a little bit of a. I had a lot of questions, especially like about Huntington's disease. Like, well, if the Huntington's disease came from, because it is a genetic disease which is supposed to pass down, from generation to generation. That was my next question. I was asking him about Huntington's disease, or like, was there like any kind of mental diseases in the family? So we were like going back and forth about that, and I did a lot of, and I did a lot of research. Like within the next days, I was, spending all night like filling out the birdsong tree, and looking at all the, figuring out, and all the people that he had talked about, like Aunt Sarah, and all the people that he had mentioned lined up with Dr. Clark's family. And I also realized that the further back I went through, and the more I was filling in the Clark and Birdsong tree, the more I was seeing names of the DNA matches. Sorry, the names of the DNA matches that I didn't know. So I didn't know. So it was, the more research I was doing, the more I was convinced that I had, a pretty strong relation to Dr. Clark and his family. And wow. So we were sending, some pictures back and forth, and I sent a picture of my dad, and, they were talking about how much that, that the pictures of my dad kind of resembled, some pictures on their side. And there's just a lot of like similarities. Like there was just things that made sense. And as I was looking at, like it turned out that I shared a lot of my DNA matches were shared with the contact who had contacted me. And like, which meant that, he and I shared a lot of the same relatives on the Birdsong side. And as I kept doing more research about like people and like how they died, I definitely saw just as much of possibilities. Like there was people who were, Dr. Clark's dad had passed away when he was about 45, I think. But there was a lot of early deaths. Like there's a lot of deaths. There was a lot of like deaths. Like I felt, the more research I did, I felt like there was just enough deaths, like deaths on the Clark side that could, and Clark and Birdsong, that where the disease could have come from. That as much as the Newman side. And it's been hard because I feel like as I've been trying to talk to different family members about all this, I get a lot of resistance, and nobody wants to believe that this is true. That I'm kind of stupid for like, I feel like they that I'm stupid for like doing the research for, but a DNA match is a DNA match, and that was going to be my question. Like that was a big question to me. Um, I also have a very straight nose, and we've always kind of joked because my like out of the Newman kids, like all like Rebecca, like my sister Rebecca and Jim, very prominent noses in our families, from my mom's side, and from like we just have